Have you noticed how life doesn't collapse all at once? It just slowly starts to feel tighter. You pause a little longer at the gas pump, staring at the price, and every longer drive makes you hesitate, wondering if it's really necessary. Not because you're spending more carelessly, but because something big is quietly disappearing behind the scenes. Oil refineries, when they begin to shut down or pull back, gas doesn't vanish overnight, but stability does. Costs ripple out from the pump to freight trucks, then to grocery stores, doctor visits, and monthly bills. What's making people uneasy isn't today's gas price. It's the growing sense that some places are slipping faster than others. In certain states, when just one link in the energy chain disappears, everything starts to wobble. And at that point, the question isn't whether this will affect your life anymore. It's where it will hit first and how soon. Number 1, California. What would happen if you woke up one morning to no breaking news, no panic on TV? Yet, something as simple as filling up your gas tank made you sit down and rethink your entire week. In California, that feeling is becoming more familiar than many people want to admit, not because America is running out of oil, but because the places that turn oil into gasoline, the refineries, are quietly disappearing from behind the scenes. What makes California slide faster than any other state is the speed at which its refining capacity is being stripped away, and it's happening in back-to-back blows. Phillips 66 has announced plans to shut down its Wilmington refinery in the Los Angeles area, which processes about 139,000 barrels a day. Valero has filed notice with the California Energy Commission that it will end refining operations at its Benicia refinery in the Bay Area, a facility that handles about 145,000 barrels a day by the end of April 2026. Together, those two closures alone represent roughly 284,000 barrels per day, enough to turn price swings from an occasional headache into a regular part of life. For decades, California has been synonymous with freedom of movement. Endless highways, sprawling suburbs, road trips that felt like opportunity itself. People drove because that's how life here was designed. Today, that same dependence has become a weakness. When refineries shut down or pull back, fuel doesn't disappear overnight, but it becomes fragile. Prices jump faster. The risk of shortages feels closer, and everyday routines suddenly require calculation. California is especially exposed because its fuel system operates almost like a world of its own. Gasoline here has to meet highly specific standards that not every refinery in the country can produce. That means when one refinery goes offline, there's no quick replacement waiting in the wings. When 2 or 3 major facilities step away within a short period, the entire system loses its buffer. Everything keeps running, but even a small disruption is enough to send prices climbing. What people feel doesn't come from reading energy reports. It shows up in daily life. At the gas station, prices change more often and feel harder to predict. At the grocery store, food costs creep up because transportation gets more expensive. Services from delivery to health care quietly add costs because getting from point A to point B now carries more risk. There's no single moment when a crisis officially begins. Just a series of hesitations, a long drive put off, an appointment rescheduled, a decision to stay home instead of going out. For retirees and families living on fixed incomes, those small hesitations stack up into real pressure. When income stays flat and everything else inches upward, gas stops being just another expense. It becomes a boundary around where you go, who you see, and what your day looks like. Independence, something many people spend a lifetime building, starts to shrink, gallon by gallon. Different parts of California feel this squeeze in different ways. In Los Angeles, long commutes turn fuel prices into an immediate hit on household budgets. In the Central Valley, where driving isn't optional, fuel becomes a survival cost. Right alongside food and housing along the coast, rising costs accelerate a trend that's been quietly unfolding for years: middle-class families leaving. Not because they want to, but because the math no longer works. What pushes California down faster than other states isn't just the loss of refineries, it's the loss of flexibility. This system was built for times of abundance, not for a slow, steady squeeze. When infrastructure is pulled away faster than new solutions are ready, a gap opens up. Inside that gap, prices swing harder, anxiety spreads faster, and people feel like they're adjusting on their own while the system lags behind. California is still wealthy, still beautiful, still a place many people dream about. But wealth doesn't protect a structure that's losing its ability to adapt. When basics like fuel become unpredictable, the future starts to feel uncertain, too, and that's why California sits at the top of this list. Not because it has already fallen, but because the signs of a familiar way of life being worn down are showing up here sooner, more clearly, and in ways that touch even the smallest decisions of everyday life. Number 2, Louisiana. If California feels like a slow squeeze, Louisiana feels like a gut punch. This is a state that didn't just rely on oil refineries, it was built around them. And when those refineries started shutting down, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was immediate, visible, and personal. Louisiana sits at the heart of America's energy corridor along the Gulf Coast. For generations, refineries here weren't just industrial sites. They were paychecks, school funding, local businesses staying alive, and entire towns built around stable union-backed jobs. When people in Louisiana talk about refineries closing, they're not talking about prices first. They're talking about livelihoods disappearing overnight. What makes Louisiana collapse faster when refineries shut down is how concentrated the impact is. When a major refinery closes here, there often isn't another employer nearby that can absorb thousands of skilled workers. These are specialized jobs, high-paying jobs, and once they're gone, the economic vacuum spreads fast. One refinery shuts its gates and suddenly contractors lose work, diners lose customers, tax revenue dries up, and housing values wobble. That's exactly what happened when large refineries like Shell's Convent facility and Phillips 66's Alliance refinery stopped operating. Entire communities were left staring at empty industrial complexes that once anchored their local economy. Workers who had planned to retire where they were found themselves scrambling. Not because they wanted to leave, but because staying no longer paid the bills. And here's where the frustration really sets in. Louisiana didn't lose these refineries because demand vanished overnight. Gasoline didn't suddenly become irrelevant here. Trucks still roll. Ports still move cargo. People still drive long distances for work, healthcare, and family. What changed was corporate math, aging facilities, rising maintenance costs, shifting regulations, and the temptation to move capital elsewhere made these refineries expendable on a spreadsheet. But for the people living nearby, nothing about their lives felt expendable. When refineries shut down in Louisiana, the pain hits in layers. First come the layoffs, then come the ripple effects. Local governments lose millions in tax revenue that once funded schools, roads, and emergency services. Small businesses feel it next. Fewer lunch crowds, fewer service contracts, fewer customers with money to spend. Before long, entire parishes start tightening their belts, cutting services, postponing repairs, and hoping nothing else breaks. Unlike California, where refinery closures mainly show up as higher prices, Louisiana gets hit from both sides. Jobs disappear. At the same time, costs rise. Fuel prices still fluctuate because supply chains get disrupted. But now, families are dealing with those increases without the income cushion they once had. That combination is brutal. There's also a deep sense of betrayal layered into the anger. Louisiana powered the country for decades. It absorbed pollution, health risks, and environmental damage in exchange for economic stability. Many communities accepted refinery life because it paid the bills. So when those same facilities shut down with little warning, little transition planning, and few replacement opportunities, people don't just feel economic loss, they feel discarded. What makes the collapse feel faster here is the lack of a safety net. Transition programs are limited. New industries don't move in overnight. Promises about future energy jobs sound hollow when the present is falling apart. People aren't asking for luxury. They're asking for continuity, for a bridge between what was taken away and whatever is supposed to come next. Louisiana isn't collapsing because it doesn't matter anymore. It's collapsing because it mattered for so long, and the system moved on without bringing its people along. When refineries shut down here, they don't just remove fuel from the market. They remove the economic backbone of entire communities, and once that backbone is gone, everything else starts to sag fast. Number 3, Pennsylvania. What happens when an entire region loses its last safety valve and only realizes it after it's gone? For Pennsylvania, the collapse didn't arrive with rising gas prices first. It arrived in silence, the kind that follows when a massive industrial heartbeat stops and never starts again. For more than a century, southeastern Pennsylvania lived with refineries as part of the landscape. They weren't loved, but they were relied on. They meant jobs that lasted decades, steady tax revenue, and a fuel supply close enough that disruptions elsewhere didn't immediately ripple through daily life. That buffer disappeared the moment the Philadelphia area refineries shut down for good. When the final major refinery in the Philadelphia region closed, Pennsylvania didn't just lose refining capacity, it lost control overnight. The state became heavily dependent on fuel arriving from far away, funneled through long pipelines, or shipped in from overseas. From that point on, every disruption, every storm, every refinery outage hundreds of miles away suddenly mattered a lot more at home. What makes Pennsylvania collapse faster in this scenario isn't sheer volume, but exposure. The state sits in a densely populated corridor where millions of people depend on constant fuel flow for commuting, logistics, healthcare access, and food distribution. When refining disappears locally, even small supply hiccups can cascade into noticeable price spikes and shortages. There's no local production left to stabilize the system. The economic damage cut even deeper. Refinery jobs in Pennsylvania weren't temporary gigs. They were careers, generational jobs that paid well enough to anchor families in place. When those facilities shut down, thousands of workers didn't just lose paychecks. Entire neighborhoods lost their economic center of gravity. Contractors, truck drivers, maintenance crews, and small businesses all felt the vacuum almost immediately. And unlike places that lose refineries gradually, Pennsylvania's shutdown was abrupt. There was no long runway for transition, no phased replacement. One moment the infrastructure existed, the next it was gone. Communities were left scrambling to adjust while the land itself sat contaminated, fenced off, and unusable, delaying any meaningful redevelopment for years. What makes the frustration sharper is that daily life didn't suddenly become cleaner or easier. People still drive, goods still move by truck, energy demand didn't vanish with the refineries. It simply shifted elsewhere along with the jobs, tax revenue, and control. Pennsylvania kept the dependence but lost the benefits. For retirees and fixed-income households, this loss of control shows up quietly. Gas prices feel less predictable. Heating costs swing harder in winter. Everyday expenses rise not because demand exploded, but because the supply chain grew longer, thinner, and more fragile. There's no villain you can point to, just a system that no longer has local backup. Number 4, Hawaii. What happens when a place runs out of backup and there's nowhere else to turn? In Hawaii, refinery closures don't just tighten the system, they expose it completely. Hawaii isn't connected to the mainland by pipelines. It can't quietly reroute fuel from a neighboring state or lean on a nearby refinery when something goes wrong. For decades, the state relied on a small number of local refineries to keep daily life stable. When those refineries shut down, Hawaii didn't lose convenience. It lost resilience. The shutdown of refineries on Oahu fundamentally changed how energy works in the islands. Once local refining stopped, Hawaii became almost entirely dependent on imported fuel shipped across the Pacific. That means longer supply chains, higher transportation costs, and far less room for error. Every delay at sea, every global price swing, every disruption thousands of miles away now lands directly on Hawaiian households. What makes Hawaii collapse faster in this scenario is isolation. When refineries close in mainland states, fuel can still be rerouted by truck or pipeline. In Hawaii, if ships don't arrive on time, there is no plan B. Fuel shortages don't stay theoretical. They become immediate risks, and the frustration runs deep because daily life here already costs more than almost anywhere else in the country. Housing is expensive, food is expensive, utilities are expensive. When fuel costs rise, they don't just add pressure, they compound it. Higher fuel prices raise electricity costs, push grocery prices even higher, and make transportation unaffordable for people who already feel stretched thin. This hits retirees especially hard. Many moved to Hawaii believing they were trading a higher cost of living for peace, stability, and community. But fixed incomes don't flex when fuel prices spike. Driving less isn't always an option on islands where public transportation is limited, and medical care often requires long trips. When refineries disappear, independence quietly goes with them. There's also anger beneath the surface. Hawaii carried the environmental and health burdens of refining for decades. Communities lived next to industrial facilities, accepted pollution, and paid the price so the islands could have energy security. When those refineries shut down without a robust transition plan, many residents felt abandoned. The risks stayed, but the benefits vanished. What makes the situation feel even more unfair is that energy demand in Hawaii hasn't disappeared. Cars still run, planes still land, ships still dock. The economy still needs fuel, but now the jobs, the control, and the stability that came with local refining are gone, replaced by dependence on distant markets that don't care how exposed the islands are. Number 5, Texas. How does the energy capital of America end up feeling unstable when refineries start shutting down? That question alone makes Texans angry, and for good reason. Texas isn't just another state in the energy system, it's the backbone. For generations, oil and refining here meant reliability, jobs you could raise a family on, and the quiet confidence that fuel would never be the problem. So when refineries in Texas begin closing or scaling back, it doesn't just rattle markets, it shakes an identity. What makes Texas collapse faster at this moment isn't a lack of oil or infrastructure. It's the speed at which long-standing assumptions are breaking. Texans grew up believing that energy shortages happened somewhere else, that if prices spiked, Texas would absorb the shock and keep things moving. But refinery shutdowns punch holes in that belief. When a major refinery in the Houston area shuts down, the impact doesn't stay local. Houston isn't just a city with refineries. It's the nerve center of Gulf Coast fuel distribution. Pipelines, exports, trucking routes, and chemical supply chains all run through it. Remove a large refinery from that system, and pressure builds everywhere at once. Supply tightens, margins disappear, and price swings travel fast. The frustration deepens because demand in Texas never slows down. People drive long distances. Trucks move nonstop. Construction, agriculture, and industry all depend on steady fuel. When refining capacity shrinks, prices rise even though consumption hasn't dropped. Families feel it immediately. Businesses feel it in operating costs. And suddenly, even in Texas, people start second-guessing trips, deliveries, and expansion plans. What really fuels the anger is the sense of betrayal. Texas carried the environmental burden, the health risks, and the industrial scars for decades to power the country. Communities lived next to refineries because they provided stability. When those facilities close, often for corporate or strategic reasons rather than local necessity, it feels like the deal was broken. The pollution stayed, the jobs didn't. Unlike California, where refinery closures mainly show up at the pump, Texas takes a double hit. Jobs disappear in energy communities. At the same time, fuel volatility spreads through the broader economy. Skilled workers with decades of experience are told to relocate or start over. Local tax bases shrink. Small businesses that served refinery workers lost their customer base almost overnight. There's also a deeper fear Texans don't always say out loud. If refinery shutdowns can happen here, they can happen anywhere. Texas was supposed to be the last place standing. When it starts losing refining capacity, it signals a system-wide shift, not an isolated problem. Texas isn't collapsing because it lacks resources. It's collapsing because certainty is eroding. The confidence that energy would always be abundant, affordable, and local is fading. And when that confidence disappears in the one state that built its identity around energy dominance, the ripple effects travel far beyond state lines. Number 6, New Mexico. What happens when a small state loses one critical piece of infrastructure and realizes there's nothing else nearby to absorb the shock? That's exactly where New Mexico finds itself as refinery capacity disappears. This was never a state with layers of backup built in. Refining here was limited, concentrated, and deeply tied to specific regions. When one facility shuts down, the loss doesn't spread out over a large system. It hits one area hard, and it hits fast. The closure of the Gallup refinery didn't just remove a plant from a map. It pulled out one of the few anchors holding together fuel supply, employment, and basic economic stability in western New Mexico. Skilled workers were suddenly left without comparable jobs nearby. These weren't positions you replace with a short drive across town. People had to choose between uprooting their families or walking away from careers they'd spent decades building. What makes New Mexico slip faster than other states is the combination of fragility and geography. Towns are far apart, distances are long. Driving isn't a convenience here, it's survival. When refining disappears, fuel has to travel farther to reach communities that already live on the edge of logistics. Every extra mile adds cost, and those costs show up quickly and visibly. The frustration is that demand never dropped. Trucks still move across the desert. Energy workers still commute long distances. Families still need reliable transportation to reach hospitals, grocery stores, and schools. But the local buffer that once softened disruptions is gone. Now every supply issue elsewhere lands directly on New Mexico's doorstep. For retirees and fixed-income households, the squeeze is immediate. There's no easy way to cut back when the nearest clinic is an hour away and the nearest store isn't much closer. Gas prices don't just rise, they crowd out everything else in the budget. Number 7, Nevada. What happens when a state doesn't lose a single refinery, yet still feels the shock faster than most? That's Nevada's problem, and it makes people furious. Nevada doesn't refine its own fuel. It never really has. Instead, it lives off fuel flowing in from neighboring states, especially California. That setup worked fine as long as California's refineries were running with some margin to spare. Once those refineries began shutting down, Nevada was instantly exposed. When refining capacity shrinks next door, Nevada doesn't get a warning period. It feels it at the pump almost immediately. Las Vegas and Reno don't have pipelines full of extra supply waiting in reserve. When California tightens, Nevada pays. Prices jump faster, shortages feel closer, and the sense of dependence becomes impossible to ignore. What makes Nevada slide quickly is how little control it has. There's no local production to stabilize prices, no industrial base to fall back on. Fuel arrives by pipeline, truck, or rail, all of which become more expensive the moment supply tightens upstream. Every disruption elsewhere turns into a direct hit here for retirees and service workers. That hit is brutal. Driving isn't optional in Nevada. Medical care, work, groceries, everything requires a car. When gas prices rise, people don't cut luxuries first. They cut necessities. Fewer doctor visits, fewer family trips, less margin, more stress. Nevada's collapse isn't about factories closing inside the state. It's about living at the end of the supply line when refineries shut down hundreds of miles away. Nevada feels it as if they closed next door, and there's nothing residents can do to stop it. Number 8, Arizona. If Nevada lives at the end of the fuel line, Arizona lives right behind it, and that makes the fall just as fast. Arizona doesn't refine its own fuel either. Like Nevada, it depends heavily on what comes from outside, especially from California and to a lesser extent, Texas. As long as those systems ran smoothly, Arizona could function without drawing much attention to that dependence. Once refineries started shutting down next door, the weakness became impossible to ignore. What makes Arizona slide so quickly is how specific its needs are. Large parts of the state, especially around Phoenix, rely on fuel blends that closely match California's standards. That means when California's refining capacity shrinks, Arizona can't simply switch suppliers overnight. Fuel has to come from farther away through longer routes at higher cost and with far less flexibility. Daily life in Arizona is built around driving. Cities are spread out, summers are brutal, walking or cutting trips isn't always realistic, especially for seniors. When gas prices spike, it hits immediately, not just at the pump, but in air conditioning costs, food deliveries, medical visits, and basic mobility. Number 9, Wyoming. What happens when a state built on energy suddenly realizes it's thinner than it looks? Wyoming feels that tension now. On paper, this is a coal and oil country. Wide open land, energy in the ground, and a long history of powering other states. But when refineries begin shutting down or converting, Wyoming's strength turns out to be narrower than many expected. Wyoming never had a large number of refineries to begin with. Its system was small, localized, and quietly fragile. When one refinery shuts down or shifts away from traditional fuel, the loss isn't spread across dozens of facilities. It lands directly on a few communities that depended on those jobs and that tax base to survive. For workers, the anger cuts even deeper. These were stable, long-term energy jobs in a state that doesn't have many high-paying replacements waiting nearby. When a refinery scales back, families face a brutal choice. Move, retrain, or accept lower wages in a place where costs are still rising. Number 10, North Dakota. Unlike other states on this list, North Dakota didn't lose refining overnight without a plan. When refining operations scaled back, parts of the system shifted toward renewable fuels instead of disappearing entirely. On paper, that looks like a softer landing. In reality, it's still a loss of control. Traditional refining jobs shrank. Local fuel production became less tied to local needs. Energy produced in the state increasingly flows outward, chasing credits and distant markets instead of stabilizing life at home. Communities didn't collapse suddenly, but they became more exposed. North Dakota is spread out, rural, and heavily car-dependent. When refining capacity changes, fuel still has to travel farther to reach people who have no alternative but to drive. Prices don't spike dramatically, but predictability fades. What's happening across these states points to an uncomfortable truth. America isn't running out of energy, but it is losing the foundations that keep everyday life stable. When refineries shut down, the impact doesn't arrive as one big crash. It seeps into every bill, every drive, and every small daily decision, especially for people living on fixed incomes. If this story reflects what you're already feeling, hit like and subscribe to Tax Hack Pro so we can keep tracking the shifts in energy, cost of living, and financial security together. And make sure you're not caught off guard as the rules quietly continue to change. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video until the end. If you found this content helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our daily video updates. Now feel free to explore other exciting videos currently shown on your screen. Goodbye and see you in the next.